The army filled the road from edge to edge. 3,000 men stretched behind Gareth in a column that had been moving since before first light, iron and leather and the low percussion of hooves on packed snow. And he had not looked back once in 3 days of march. There was nothing useful behind him. Draveth was ahead, 2 days beyond the point where Ironvale's forest thinned into open terrain, and the campaign that had consumed his winter was finally in motion. He kept his eyes forward. He looked forward and found a girl. She stood in the center of the road with both feet planted and both hands wrapped around a rope. The rope ran behind her to a wooden crate that sat heavy and immovable on the ground. The column's front line had stopped without a formal order. His lead riders had pulled their horses short and were looking at each other with the particular expression of men uncertain what they were permitted to do about a situation no one had prepared them for. Gareth brought his horse forward through the gap they made. She was young. That was the first thing he registered clearly. Young and slight, wrapped in a wool cloak that had been mended in 3 places he could see from the saddle, her dark hair matted against her cheeks by the snow still coming down. She looked up at him without flinching. He was long accustomed to people flinching when he rode toward them. "Move off the road," he said. "No," she said. The word dropped between them flat and final, like something she had already decided before he arrived. Behind him, he heard the subtle shift of thousands of men absorbing the fact that a girl in a worn cloak had just refused the Alpha King on a military road. He studied her from the saddle. Her hands on the rope were raw and red from cold. The skin cracked at the knuckles. Her boots were soaked through and had been for some time. The leather had darkened to the shade of wet bark. The wooden box behind her was rough-made, no sealant, just wide enough and long enough to carry. He understood what it was before he asked the question. "What's in the crate?" She held his gaze without wavering. "My brother. His name is Finn. He was 12 years old. Was." The past tense settled over the road with the falling snow. He let the silence hold for a moment, then said, "Where are you taking him?" "Stone Crown Peak. It's north of here." She tilted her chin toward the tree line. "You're going south. We don't have a problem with each other's direction. You're standing in the middle of a military road. Your army has 2 sides to it. They can use one." She said it the way a person says something they have already reasoned through completely and found entirely sensible. There was no performance to it, no defiance for the sake of making a point. She simply believed what she said and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He looked past her at the channel the crate had carved into the snow, a long, uneven groove running back toward the tree line she had come from. She had been dragging it for hours. The snow had not stopped falling, and she had not stopped either. How did he die? The question came out quieter than he intended. Something moved across her face, brief and controlled. Not grief breaking through, but the particular tightness of someone holding it exactly where they need it to stay. "Soldiers," she said. 3 nights ago. He was on the road north of my village." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was level. "They were carrying your banner." The word landed with the weight of certainty. Not accusation, not anger, just a fact presented in the same even tone as everything else she had said, which made it worse somehow. He heard it and believed it without debate, and that belief carried something with it, a pressure behind the sternum that had no clean name. "My men had no orders to move through that corridor," he said. "I know what I saw." He did not argue with her. He looked at her face and found nothing there that suggested she was mistaken or embellishing or asking him to feel something in particular. She was stating what happened. "Your father," he said. "Your family. My father's buried in the village. Same night." She said it without ceremony. "They killed him when they came through. He'd told Finn to run before they arrived. Finn didn't get far enough." Something shifted at the corner of her jaw. "My mother died when I was 8. It's just been the 3 of us. 2 of them now. And she was standing on a road alone. What's at Stone Crown Peak? A marker my father built when I was young. He mapped that route himself, made me memorize every turn and crossing when I was 10. Said there might come a day I needed it without him." Her eyes moved briefly to the crate and then back to him. "I need to reach it before the 3rd snowfall. After that, the ground will be sealed, and I won't be able to do what I need to do for him. What is it that you need to do? Something that matters to me, she said quietly. That's what it is. He did not push further. He understood the nature of things that mattered without requiring an explanation. The wolf in him had been dormant since the start of the march, conserved for the territory ahead, the way his instincts always settled before a campaign. But when she had spoken her brother's name, when she had stood in the road and looked up at him and stated the plainest possible truth without flinching, something had moved inside his chest without any instigation he could account for. Not attraction, not threat response. Something more akin to recognition. A pressure shifting into place like a key seated in a lock. He pressed it down and kept his expression still. How far is Stone Crown Peak? 2 days north from this road if I move without stopping. And the third snowfall? 2.5 days by the look of the clouds. Less. She looked at the sky for a moment. I don't have margin to spare. He turned his horse without another word and rode back to the head of the column, where Voss waited with the patient expression of a man who had learned that silence was often the more useful response. I need a rider to Fen, Gareth said. Written orders. He takes the column forward and holds position at the base camp 2 days out from Dreveth. He does not advance without me. Voss absorbed this. And you? I'm going north for 3 days. Have someone take wood from the supply carts. I want a proper sled built. Runners, braced crossbeams, strong enough to carry significant weight over uneven ground. A pause, short and careful. For the girl's crate. Write the orders for Fen, Gareth said. I'll need 2 guards and 3 horses. He rode back to where Willa stood, waiting with the rope still in both hands. We're building you a sled, he said. It'll move faster than dragging. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. I didn't ask for that. No, he said simply. She looked at the crate, then back at him. She said nothing further, which he accepted as agreement. He dismounted and waited in the snow while his men worked. The main column moved past him in a long, grinding river of iron and stamping hooves, the full weight of a campaign he had spent months planning. And all of it felt strangely distant from where he was standing. He did not try to make sense of that. There was no use examining things before they had a shape. The sled came together quickly. When it was finished, 2 of his guards transferred the crate to the runners with a careful steadiness that told him they had understood the situation, and he was glad he didn't have to say it out loud. Willa stood back while they worked, hands at her sides, watching with the focused stillness of someone who had decided that maintaining control over what happened to the crate was the last thing fully in her power. When it was settled, she moved to it herself, tested the rope's hold on the frame, ran her fingers along the join between the sideboards and the base. When she straightened and looked at him, her expression had not softened. But something in it had moved, the faint, reluctant acknowledgement of something she hadn't asked for and couldn't dismiss. I'll go north from here, she said. You'd be losing days. I'm aware. I'm not going to be what you expect on this road. He looked at her steadily. I'm not expecting anything. She considered that for a moment, the way she seemed to consider everything, briefly, thoroughly, and without conclusion offered. Then she turned north and picked up the rope. He fell into step beside her. 2 of his guards followed at a respectful distance. The army moved south without him, the sound of it receding over the course of a long mile until Ironvale's tree line absorbed it entirely, and the road held only the hiss of sled runners on compacted snow, the quiet movement of horses, and the steady rhythm of walking. The forest closed over them by midday. He had sent no message explaining his decision to anyone other than Fen. There was nothing he could have written that would have satisfied a general or a council or even himself. He had looked at a girl standing alone in the snow with her brother's body behind her, and something in him had made a decision before his reason was consulted. He could trace it back to the thing that had shifted in his chest when she spoke. The wolf going still and attentive in a way he did not recognize from battle, from territory disputes, from any of the situations that had tested him before. He knew what the mate bond felt like in the abstract. Every shifter did. He had never felt it, had begun to suspect in the quiet hours of his 32nd year that he perhaps never would. He was not ready to name what had happened on the road, but he did not dismiss it either. Willa walked ahead of him by half a step with her eyes on the path and her hand light on the rope, and she did not look back to verify he was still there because she had already made her assessment and acted on it. He found that he respected the efficiency of that, even as he was still catching up to it himself. Somewhere behind him, 3,000 men were marching to war. Somewhere ahead, a mountain was waiting. The trees thinned and closed in turns as the trail curved deeper north, and the snow came down in the particular silence of a forest that had stopped keeping track of time. And Gareth walked without speaking, because there was nothing yet that needed to be said. The trail north through Ironvale was older than any road his engineers had mapped. It had no name on any document Gareth had reviewed in the course of planning the campaign. Just a thin line on a surveyor's copy, unmarked, passing through the densest section of the forest before climbing toward the high ground that preceded Stonecrown's Ridge. It appeared unreliable on paper. In person, it was something else. Packed earth beneath the snow, the compression of decades of use, the kind of path that had been found and walked and found again by people who needed it rather than people who had built it. Willa knew every turn. She walked ahead of the sled with the rope over her shoulder and corrected the first wrong turn before anyone else had registered there was a fork. The trail split around a fallen oak with no visible marker to distinguish one side from the other, and she went left without breaking stride. Gareth's lead guard took the right, caught himself 2 steps in when the undergrowth thickened, and rejoined the path without comment. The second correction came an hour later at a crossing where a frozen stream cut beneath the trail. The stones beneath were uneven, and the bank on the far side dropped sharply before leveling out. She guided the sled across at an angle that distributed the weight differently, directing the guards without asking for their cooperation, just telling them where to stand and what to hold, in the tone of someone explaining something that ought to be obvious once stated. They followed her direction without discussion, which seemed to faintly surprise her, though she said nothing about it. Gareth walked behind and observed and kept his assessment to himself. She had memorized this route as a child. That much was plain. But there was a difference between memorizing a path and carrying it in the body the way she did, in the angle of her steps before a slope, in the half-second pause before each fork where she made no visible choice but emerged already moving in the right direction. Her father had not simply taught her the road. He had taught her how to read it. The morning moved slowly. The cold was the persistent kind, not sharp but constant, the kind that settled into the joints and stayed. Gareth's guards were trained for worse and did not complain. Willa did not complain either, which was less remarkable, except that her boots were still darkened from the previous day's wet, and she was moving at a pace that kept the sled from falling behind on the uneven ground. He watched the set of her shoulders and said nothing. Sometime near midday, he heard hoofbeats behind them, a single horse, moving at a canter, not trying to be quiet. His guards turned and reached for weapons. He raised a hand before they drew. Voss came through the tree line at a pace just short of urgency, his breath visible in the cold air and his horse blowing hard from the ride. He slowed when he saw Gareth and brought the animal to a stop a few yards back with the expression of a man prepared to defend a decision that had not been formally permitted. "The general has the column," Voss said. "Your written orders were clear. He understands them, and he'll hold position." "I gave you clear orders as well," Gareth said. "You did," Voss agreed, without any particular apology in it. A pause settled between them. Gareth studied him, the careful neutrality on his face, the way Voss held himself when he had made a judgment call he believed in, which was differently from how he held himself in most other situations. There was no performance of deference in it. Just a man standing in the snow who had made a choice and was not going to pretend he hadn't. "Ride behind," Gareth said, and turned north. Voss fell into position without another word. He did not justify further when the decision had already been accepted. Gareth had not dismissed him, which was all the answer either of them needed. Willa had not stopped walking during the exchange. She had slowed, fractionally, in the way of someone taking in information without appearing to, and then resumed her pace when it became clear the situation had resolved itself. She did not ask who Voss was or what had passed between them. Gareth noted that too. The trees thinned briefly in the early afternoon, opening onto a stretch of higher ground where the wind came across without obstruction. The snow hit differently there, horizontal and sustained, and the temperature dropped with it. Willa tucked her chin and kept moving. The sled runners left clean lines in the fresh accumulation, straight and deliberate, as if the direction were already decided and the snow was simply recording it. The abandoned inn appeared in the late afternoon, half buried by the drifts banked against its north wall. 2 stories of heavy timber, one window boarded, the other's shutter hanging at an angle from a broken upper hinge. The roof had held through the season, which mattered. The interior was cold and carried the particular staleness of an enclosed space that had not been disturbed in months, but the hearth was intact and the floor was dry beneath the dust. Willa brought the sled to a stop outside the door. She did not go inside immediately. She stood beside the crate for a moment with her hand resting flat on its top board. Not gripping, just resting, a brief contact that belonged to her alone. He looked away from it. Inside, one of the guards built a fire from a tarp-covered stack of split wood near the hearth, dry enough to catch quickly. The warmth came slowly, but it came. The other guard cleared the worst of the debris from the far corner and checked the upper floor for anything that could compromise the structure in the night. It held. They ate without ceremony. Field rations, dried meat, hard bread. Willa ate quickly and without apparent interest in the food itself, the focused attention of someone refueling rather than tasting. When she finished, she moved back outside, and through the gap in the boarded window, Gareth could see the dim shape of her in the dark beside the sled, the snow still falling in slow curtains around her. He did not follow. He stayed near the fire and let the others settle. And after a while, her voice reached him through the wall, low and not carrying. The tone a person uses when they are not intending to be heard at distance. She was talking to Finn. He could not make out every word. What came through the gap in the boards was the cadence of it, the register of a person speaking to someone they know so completely that there is no measuring of the right amount of care, no calibrating of what to say and what to withhold. She told him something about a trade route their father had mapped and never finished. She said something about a horse she had been saving toward. Her voice dropped lower for a stretch and did not rise again for some time, and whatever she said in that lower register, she kept entirely to herself. Gareth looked at the fire and kept his eyes there. His guards had found what sleep was available to trained men on an unfamiliar floor. Voss was awake on the far side of the hearth, back to the wall, watching Gareth with the quiet attention he brought to things he had not yet decided how to file away. Neither of them spoke. Outside, Willa's voice rose once more briefly and then went quiet, and the fire worked against the cold with a steady patience that made no promises. He did not sleep easily. The wolf had been alert since the road and had not settled. Not the sharpness of an identified threat, but the sustained wakefulness of instincts that had registered something unresolved and declined to release it. He lay on the inn floor and tracked the sounds of the forest through the walls the way he had learned to do in his first years of campaign, sorting what was natural from what was not. He was somewhere at the shallow edge of sleep when he felt the shift. It was not sound, precisely. Or it was, but below the threshold of conscious hearing, processed first by the wolf and passed upward to his attention afterward. A pattern that did not belong to the forest's night language. Weight on ground, spaced with the particular even distribution of men who had been taught to move quietly and had practiced it, but had been taught by someone more familiar with stone corridors than tree roots. Animals moved with biological purpose. What he was registering moved with intent. He was halfway to his feet when the door opened. Willa came through it fast and crossed the dark room without hesitation. Her hand found his arm in the blackness and closed around it, and she pulled, and the sound she made was not a word, just a short, sharp exhale at the back of her throat that meant stop, or wait, or don't move yet. And he understood it without translation and stopped. The arrow came through the gap in the boarded window a half-second later and drove itself into the timber of the opposite wall at exactly the height his head had occupied. For a moment the room held completely still. Then it didn't. Voss was through the door before either guard had fully processed the situation, his shift happening mid-stride, the distinctive fracture and reset of bone and tissue reorganizing under pressure, a sound Gareth had heard hundreds of times, and which still carried a physical authority that no human movement matched. The shape of a man became something larger and faster by the time he cleared the threshold. The guards followed. Gareth moved last, pulling Willa behind him and placing her against the interior wall before going out himself. 4 scouts, positioned in a practiced arc around the inn's entrance, angled to cover the door and both sides. Not a patrol that had stumbled across unexpected travelers. A deliberate placement, set and waiting, with knowledge of the building's layout and the likely exit points. Someone had told them where to wait and how long. The engagement was brief. Shifter speed in close quarters against scouts who had planned for a sleeping target. The miscalculation collapsed their advantage within seconds. 2 were subdued. 1 fled into the dark tree line. 1 did not survive the first moment of contact with Voss in a form that did not accommodate restraint in its initial state. When the clearing had settled, Gareth stood in the snow outside the inn's door and became aware of 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the scouts had carried no pack insignia on their outer gear, which was a deliberate choice, not an oversight. The second was that Willa had not released his arm. He wasn't certain she had registered it. Her grip had tightened at the sound of Voss shifting, a reflex, the body responding faster than thought, and she had turned her face toward the tree line with a focused attention that matched his own in kind, if not in origin. No wolf in her, no supernatural hearing. Just a girl who had spent years learning to read terrain by its sounds, and who was doing exactly that now, cataloging the forest's response to the disruption, measuring what was still moving out there against what had gone quiet. He became aware of the heat. It moved upward from the point of contact, from her grip through the wool of his sleeve, up the arm, into the chest. And it had a quality distinct from warmth generated by proximity or exertion. Something more interior. Something that had been in motion longer than he had consciously acknowledged, moving from the place where her hand pressed and settling with a weight that was not pressure, but presence. The wolf went very still inside him in the particular way it did when something significant had been confirmed rather than discovered. He had not named it on the road when it first moved. He had pressed it down and marched north and told himself the shape of it would clarify in time. Standing in the dark with an arrow in the wall behind him, clarity arrived without invitation. Willa stepped away to help steady one of the restrained scouts for questioning. Her grip released, and the cold rushed back against his sleeve. He let her go and crossed to Voss and directed his attention to the interrogation, which was brief and yielded little. Low-ranking field scouts. They carried coordinates and a target description and the route they had been assigned to watch. They could not name the source of their orders beyond a relay point in Korath's advanced intelligence structure. They knew the route they had been told to monitor. Someone had known this route. Someone had known Gareth would be on it. Voss moved through the scouts methodically after they had been bound, checking for documents or secondary materials with the thorough attention he brought to intelligence work. From the inner lining of the lead scout's coat, he withdrew a folded note. Not formal orders, just a short briefing, route and timing and a target window. He unfolded it and read it once and then looked at the bottom. A seal pressed into dark wax. Small and precise, the design intricate in the way of official correspondence, not military, administrative. He had seen it hundreds of times on documents that moved through the capital's council chambers. He knew exactly whose it was. He folded the note closed with 2 fingers and pressed it into the interior of his own coat without speaking. His eyes moved briefly across the clearing to where Gareth stood, occupied with one of the guards near the tree line. Voss looked at where the note sat against his chest. He needed daylight to examine the seal fully. He needed to be certain before he said anything, because the name attached to that seal was not one you brought to a king on a cold night with partial evidence and a disrupted camp, and the expectation that it would be received with anything other than the gravity it deserved. The implication of it, if he was right, was not a thing that could be walked back once stated. He went inside and sat with his back against the wall and watched the door until the forest outside began to lighten. In the clearing, Gareth had crossed to where Willa stood beside the sled. She was kneeling in the snow with her hand on the crate's sideboard, not gripping, just resting there the way she had before they went inside. She did not look up when his boots stopped behind her. "You heard them before I did," he said. The step spacing was wrong for anything living in this forest, she said. Foxes don't move in straight lines on a quiet approach. Deer stagger their weight. Whatever those men had been taught about moving through trees, they learned it from someone who'd spent more time on stone floors than on ground like this. She said it without satisfaction, just description. The fact of a thing, recorded and passed on. He stood in the snow and looked at her kneeling there in the dark and did not speak for a long moment. The night had gone fully quiet around them. The forest resettled, the disturbance absorbed back into ordinary winter stillness. "The trail rises tomorrow," he said. "You should sleep." She nodded once, her hand still on the crate. He went inside and lay down on the inn floor and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. The bridge was gone. Not collapsed, not damaged from weather or age. Gone, deliberately, the central timber cut clean through on both sides where it met the supporting posts. The crossbeams dropped into the frozen stream below and left there in a tangle of broken wood that had been under ice long enough to suggest the cutting had not happened recently. Someone had taken the bridge out weeks ago, possibly longer. It had not been an accident, and it had not been done carelessly. Willa stood at the edge and looked down at the wreckage without apparent surprise. "There's another way," she said. "It adds time." "How much time?" Gareth said. "Half a day, maybe a little more depending on the upper ground." She looked at the sky, then back at the trail ahead. The cloud cover had thickened since morning, sitting lower on the ridgeline and carrying the particular dense gray of weather still organizing itself. "We have margin, not comfortable margin. Show me the route." She turned without waiting for his guards to reposition and moved east along the stream bank, pulling the sled behind her at an angle to keep the runners clear of the uneven ground near the water's edge. Gareth followed. Voss came behind without being told. The eastern detour climbed. That was the first thing that became apparent within an hour. The terrain rose steadily through a section of loose stone and old root systems where the forest's lower density gave way to scrub growth and exposed hillside. The sled, which had moved with reasonable ease on the flat trail, became something different on an incline. The weight shifted back against the pull of the rope, and the runners caught on half-buried stones and required constant adjustment. Willa did not ask for help with it. She redistributed the rope over her shoulder and leaned into the grade and moved with the focused, paced effort of someone who had already done the arithmetic and decided that complaining was not a productive use of the available energy. One of Gareth's guards moved to the back of the sled and pushed without discussion. She did not acknowledge it, but she did not refuse it either. The upper path leveled briefly around midday at a shelf of land where the hillside flattened before rising again toward the stone-crowned ridgeline. From the shelf, through a break in the low cloud, Gareth could see the trail ahead, cutting back and forth across the face of the slope in the long, switching pattern of a path built for load-bearing rather than speed. Whoever had made it had done so with practical intelligence. The grade never exceeded what a person carrying weight could sustain, and the switchbacks were placed at natural resting points where the ground offered a flat purchase. Edric had mapped this. He was certain of it. The route had the same quality he had been observing in Willa's navigation since the previous morning, not marked by signs or blazes, but engineered by someone who understood the difference between a path that exists and a path that works. They were on the third switchback, moving at a steady pace with the sled tracking cleanly on the packed snow, when the rope broke. It went without warning, a sharp crack from somewhere in the middle of the line where the hemp had been under sustained tension across 2 days of irregular terrain. The tension released all at once, and Willa lurched forward, suddenly without the load's resistance behind her. And in the same instant, the sled began to move. The grade was not extreme at the switchback's angle, but a loaded wooden sled with iron runners on compacted snow needed very little encouragement. It found the incline and accelerated toward the outer edge of the path, where the shelf dropped sharply into the rocky channel of the stream below. Gareth moved. He did not think it. The wolf moved first, the instinct that operated below conscious decision and faster than deliberate action, the part of him that had assessed the sled's trajectory and the slope's angle, and arrived at the only position that mattered before the rest of him had processed what was happening. He crossed the width of the path and caught the rear corner of the crate with both hands and drove his heels into the packed snow and stopped it. The impact moved through his shoulders and back with the full transferred force of the crate's weight and momentum, and his boots cut furrows in the snow before they held. He felt the edge of the path at the backs of his heels and did not move his feet. Behind him, the drop was close enough that he could hear the stream's cold movement in the channel below. He held it. The silence afterward had a compressed quality. Voss was already braced against the sled's side, adding his weight to the hold. The guards had stopped on the path above. Willa had turned in the same moment he'd moved and was now standing 2 feet away with her eyes on the crate and her hands already working at the broken rope, pulling the ends together, assessing what remained and what could be salvaged. She worked quickly and without speaking. Her fingers moved through the repairing with the practiced certainty of someone who had knotted rope in the cold before, finding the sound sections and binding the brake with a double wrap that would hold under tension. Gareth maintained the hold until she finished, until she had passed the mended rope back through the sled's front hooks and settled the slack with both hands. "Ready," she said. He released it carefully, walking his hands back along the crate's side as the weight transferred onto the rope again and the sled settled flat on the path. She ran her thumb along the knotted repair once, checking the hold. Then she looked at him. He was close enough that he could see clearly the thing she was deciding, the acknowledgement moving across her face against something that resisted giving it. She was not ungrateful. She was someone who had been managing alone for long enough that receiving help had to be consciously processed before it could be accepted as real. "Thank you," she said. Short and direct. "The same register as everything else," she said. He nodded once and stepped back to let her lead. They made the shepherd's shelter by late afternoon. It sat at the high point of the detour route, a stone structure built into the slope's natural curve, low-roofed and thick-walled in the way of buildings designed to outlast seasons rather than impress anyone who saw them. The door was heavy and opened inward with resistance from a drift that had built against its base. Inside, the space was small enough that 5 people occupied it without crowding only if no one moved unnecessarily. There was a firebox in the corner, stone-built, with a flue that had survived the winter intact. Dried fuel had been stacked inside against the back wall, the preserved resource of whoever maintained this shelter for the high pasture season. The guards built the fire with careful economy, and the warmth arrived slowly, edging outward from the box into the cold air by inches. Outside, the weather that had been organizing itself since morning arrived fully. Wind came off the high ground with sustained force, driving the snow sideways against the stone walls, and the sound of it in the flue was constant and low, a long-held note that did not vary. There was no question of continuing until it settled. Willa sat near the fire with her hands extended toward the warmth, palms out. The knuckles on her right hand had cracked further from the cold and the ropework, and she pressed them together with a brief automatic attention that told him she had noticed and moved on. After a time, she drew her knees up and looked at the fire. The guards were quiet. Voss was quiet. Gareth sat on the far side of the firebox with his back against the wall and watched the light move in the hearth and did not look at her too often or too obviously. She spoke eventually, the way a person speaks when the silence has gone long enough that the thing they have been holding needs somewhere to go. "My father had been receiving correspondence for months before the soldiers came," she said. Not an announcement, just something stated into the available space. "Letters from different sources. I didn't know what they contained. He didn't tell me everything." She paused. "He told me enough." Gareth waited. He was mapping routes. Not just geographic routes, negotiated ones. Corridors where supplies or people could move across the border without becoming part of the war directly. He thought if both sides had access to those corridors, the incentive to push through by force would be reduced. She looked at the fire. He was feeding information to both sides in order to do it. He wasn't choosing between them. He was trying to remove the need for the choice. "That's a dangerous position," Gareth said. He knew that. Her voice was level. He sent Finn north before the soldiers came. He knew they were coming. Someone had told him, or he had worked it out from something in the correspondence. He sent Finn to the shelter point we had established and said he would follow. She stopped. He didn't follow. No. The fire moved in the box. The wind against the walls did not let up. Before he sent Finn, he hid something, she continued. I don't know what it was. I found the place where it had been kept at the house, a loose board under the floor of his study. Whatever was there, he had moved before the soldiers arrived. He left nothing behind that they could take from him. A short pause. He planned it carefully. He just ran out of time to do all of it. Gareth looked at her profile in the firelight. The line of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders when she was stating facts she had already finished grieving. Not because the grief was done, but because she had moved it to a place where it did not interfere with the thing she needed to do. He recognized that disposition. He had lived in it for years. The soldiers at your village, he said. They were not operating under my campaign orders. She looked at him then. The route through that corridor was not designated. My campaign plan moved south from the main road. Your village was not in any mapped advance zone. He kept his voice even and his eyes on her. Someone directed them to that location using my authority without my knowledge. She held his gaze for a moment and said nothing. He could see her processing it, not disbelieving, not relieved, just placing the information into the structure of what she already knew and examining where it fit. Then, whoever directed them knew where my father lived, she said. They knew what he was doing. Yes, and they used your army to stop him. That's what the evidence suggests. Another pause. Then, Edric mentioned a name in one of the letters I found before I left the village. He wrote it in connection with the correspondence. Someone who had reached out to him through an intermediary. Someone who knew about the route mapping and had initially seemed interested in the project. She looked back at the fire. The name was Hadwin. Gareth went still. Voss, from his position against the far wall, raised his eyes from the floor and met Gareth's across the fire without speaking. Hadwin, senior counsel, responsible for campaign logistics and supply routing, present at every strategic meeting since the war's planning began. A man who knew every designated advance zone, every supply corridor, every gap in the campaign's formal orders. A man who had the access and the authority to direct a unit through an undesignated area and attach Gareth's banner to the movement without a written order that would survive review. Voss reached into his coat and withdrew the folded note from the inn. He crossed the shelter and handed it to Gareth without a word. Gareth unfolded it and tilted it toward the firelight. The document was brief: route coordinates, a target window, a tactical description of the building's layout and exit points. At the bottom, a seal pressed in dark wax, small and precise. He had seen it on hundreds of documents over 7 years of council work. He knew the design completely. He folded the note and held it in both hands and looked at the fire for a long time. Willa was watching him. She did not press for an explanation. She seemed to understand from the quality of the silence that what he was processing was significant, and she gave him the room to process it. That was a kind of consideration he had not expected from someone who had cause to demand answers immediately, and the fact of it registered with him clearly. The name on this seal, he said finally, is Hadwin. She absorbed this without visible surprise, as if some part of her had already begun drawing the line between the name in her father's letter and the scouts on the inn road, between the scouts and whatever authority had directed them. He knew your father's work, Gareth continued. He would have known what your father was hiding, and he has access to my campaign structure complete enough to move men through corridors my formal orders never designated. He's been looking for whatever my father hid, she said, and looking for you. He met her eyes. Whatever Edric concealed, Hadwin needs it recovered or destroyed. Your father sending you north with knowledge of the hidden location makes you a liability he can't leave unaddressed. She was quiet for a moment. This started before Finn died. It started before your village, he said. The fire burned. The wind moved against the walls with its constant, unvarying force. Outside, the snow had made the world entirely white and entirely without distance. Willa pulled her knees closer and looked at the flames with an expression he had no simple word for. Not fear, not despair, not the performance of either. the particular quality of someone who has just understood the full dimensions of the thing they are inside of and has accepted it as the truth of where they stand. Gareth remained against the wall across from her and felt the mate bond pressing against the inside of his chest with a sustained, quiet insistence he had not found a way to push back against since the road. It was different from the initial shock of it, less abrupt, more like gravity, not a force-demanding response, but one that simply operated regardless of his position on the matter. The wolf had made its assessment on the road and had not revised it since. He looked at her in the firelight. This girl who had memorized routes and read terrain and fixed rope and stated the plainest truths he had heard in years, and who was sitting in a cold shepherd's shelter with her brother's body outside in the snow and a council trader's name in her father's letters, and who had not once collapsed under any of it. He stayed where he was when the guards eventually slept. He stayed when Voss went quiet in his corner. He stayed when the fire burned lower and the cold came back to the edges of the room. At some point he crossed to the door and positioned himself near it, back against the wall beside the frame, facing the room. He told himself it was watch habit. The discipline of a man who had kept campaign overnight without sleep, enough times that the practice was automatic. He did not move from that position until the wind broke and the gray light of morning began to come through the gap beneath the door. And by then, Willa had not stirred, and the shelter had held all night. And the trail to Stonecrown waited above them in the new quiet of a storm that had said what it had to say and was finished. The third snowfall came at dawn. Willa had been awake to see it start, the first pale flakes descending through the lightless gap beneath the shelter door, slow and deliberate in the way of weather that has found its moment and is not in any hurry. She sat up from the floor without disturbing the others and went outside and stood in the cold and watched it begin. The trail up to Stonecrown Peak was visible from the shelter's high position, a pale cut against the hillside's dark stone face, rising in long switchbacks through the last section of exposed terrain before the summit. She could see the peak itself, its ridge serrated against the low cloud, the marker stones her father had placed there just visible as dark shapes in the growing light. She had been here once before, 10 years old, following Edric up the final switchback in late summer heat while he explained the route's details and the marker's location and what the site was for. He had been methodical about it, not alarming, not framing it as preparation for catastrophe, but as practical knowledge, the kind a person of her family should carry. He had said, "If there is ever a time when you need to reach me and the usual ways are closed, come here. I will find you." She pressed her palm against the doorframe and did not let herself stand inside that memory too long. Inside the shelter, she gathered what she needed and woke no one. Gareth was against the wall by the door. She did not know if he had slept at all. His eyes opened when she moved, tracking her without alarm and without demanding explanation. She looked at him briefly. He looked back. She went outside and took the sled's rope. When he stepped out after her to steady the runners on the first rise, she said, "You stop at the last turn below the summit shelf. You and the others wait there unless I call." He looked up the trail, then back at her. Very well. Nothing more was required. She took the rope again and began the climb. The ascent was the hardest section of the entire route. The switchbacks were manageable, but the grade between them was steep, and the storm's snowfall had layered over the older compaction in a way that made the upper surface deceptively soft. Each step required a different calculation than the flat trail had. The sled's weight pulled behind her with a quality that felt less like resistance and more like argument, continuous, not sudden, requiring sustained effort without the compensation of forward momentum. She did not stop. Her father had not built this marker in a location that was easy to reach, and she had understood at 10 years old that this was intentional. The site needed to be findable by someone who knew it and difficult to stumble upon by someone who didn't. The final section before the summit shelf narrowed to a single-person width, with a stone face on one side and a long drop on the other. And she managed the sled's runners along the outer edge with both hands and a judgment built from knowing exactly how wide the crate was and exactly how much clearance remained. At the top, the trail leveled onto a broad shelf of stone, swept partially clear by the wind. The marker stones stood in a rough ring at the shelf's northern edge, 6 upright pieces of irregular granite that Edric had placed and fitted together over multiple trips, weighted and seated in the natural crevices so that they would hold through any weather. They had held. 8 years since she had last seen them, and they stood exactly as her father had left them. She brought the sled to the flat ground and stopped. Below, at the trail's base, she could make out the shapes of Gareth and his men waiting at the distance they had agreed. Far enough that the shelf felt private, close enough that the trail remained covered. Gareth had not questioned the arrangement when she stated it on the descent from the shelter. He had simply nodded and remained, which was a form of understanding she had not anticipated and had not been prepared for. She had spent 3 days waiting for him to behave the way powerful men, in her experience, had always eventually behaved, and he kept not doing it, and she did not yet know how to place that fact inside anything she understood. She pulled the sled to the center of the marker ring and let herself stand still for a moment. The third snowfall was coming down steadily now, not the storm's force, but consistent and committed, the kind that would continue through the day and seal the ground by nightfall. She had made it. That was the only thought she permitted herself before the rest came in. She had made it, and Finn was here, and this was the place her father had chosen as the family's fixed point, and she had reached it before the ground closed. She knelt beside the crate and pressed her forehead against the sideboard. Then she set both hands to the lid and worked the pegged fastening loose. Her father had built the crate for travel rather than permanence, fitted to hold, fitted also to open without tools if the road demanded it. She lifted the top aside and looked at Finn properly for the first time since the village, not in the fractured practical glimpses the journey had allowed, but fully. He was wrapped in the gray blanket from their house, and in her father's winter cloak beneath it, the one she had pulled from the peg by the door before she left because the nights on the road were too cold to risk less. The cold had kept him unchanged. Snow had not touched him. The stillness was exactly the stillness she had found. At the center of the marker ring, where the 6 stones cut the wind and held the drifting snow to a shallower depth, the shelf collected a bed of soil over the mountain stone. Her father had lined the base years ago with flat slate to keep the footing from washing out in thaw season. She had not understood, when she was 10, why he had made that lined cut longer than the engineering required. She understood now. She cleared the drift from it with both hands and a loose piece of granite from the ring's inner edge. The upper crust had taken the night's freeze, but below it, the earth still yielded where the stones had protected it from the worst of the weather. It was hard work. That did not matter. It needed to be possible, and it was. What followed was not something she had planned, because grief does not organize itself by plan. She talked to him while she worked. She told him about the route, each junction she had read, each correction she had made, each moment where the trail offered no certainty, and she had moved through it anyway. She told him she had kept the small cloth marker he carried at the bottom of his travel pack, the one their father had given him when he turned 10. She had taken it from the pack before she left the village. It was in her pocket now. It was going with him. She told him she was angry, that the anger had been in her since the road where she found him, and she had not had space to examine it fully, and she did not know yet what she would do with it, but she was going to do something with it. Not nothing. Never nothing. She told him about the Alpha King, briefly and with the particular careful tone of someone describing something they have not yet categorized. She told him there was a name she had uncovered, and that the name connected to every loss she had not understood until 3 days ago, and that she intended to make something of that connection. She did not know exactly what yet, but she would. When the cut was deep enough, she unwrapped the blanket's upper fold and touched his hair once, briefly, because anything longer would have asked for a kind of collapse she could not yet afford. She placed the cloth marker in his hands and folded the blanket back into place. She lifted him from the crate with both arms and lowered him into the lined earth. The motion was careful, the final practical task she would ever perform for him. For one moment, she kept her hands where they were, one at his shoulder, one over the folded blanket at his chest. Then she let go. She covered him slowly. Earth first. Then the flat slate pieces her father had stacked at the ring's edge against weather shift, fitted over the filled cut, so spring thaw would not take the soil with it, then stone enough that the mountain itself seemed to take custody of him. By the time she finished, her fingers were numb and dark with soil and meltwater, and the place where the cut had been looked less like a wound than a sealed part of the shelf. She stayed kneeling for a long time. When she stood, her knees were stiff from the cold stone, and her face was wet from something that had not been snow. She wiped her face once and stood looking at the marker stones and the place where Finn lay within them, and then moved to the anchor piece, the largest of the 6, seated deeper than the others, and positioned at the ring's northern point. Edric had told her, on the descent 8 years ago, that the anchor stone's base was lined with flat slate. He had explained it as engineering. The slate prevented frost from shifting the footing. She had nodded at 10 years old with the partial attention of a child who was memorizing the important part and letting the technical explanation move through her. The important part, she had understood even then, was that the flat stone had been put there deliberately. She dug around the anchor stone's base with both hands. The snow came out in packed sections. Beneath it, soil that the previous night's storm had frozen in its upper layer but not fully. The stone's shelter had kept the ground beneath from sealing completely. She worked down through the soil with focused, methodical movements, and eventually her fingers found something flat and smooth. Slate. Then beneath it, a rectangular shape fitted and sealed with something that had once been wax, but had been reinforced with a pitch resin that had set hard against the years. The box was not large, palm-sized, thick enough to contain several folded sheets. Sealed against moisture with a care that said clearly, "This was placed here to wait." In her father's small, precise hand on the box's upper surface, Willa. She opened it there at the anchor stone with her back to the wind. The sheets inside were densely marked in the cartographic notation Edric had taught her across years of her childhood without ever announcing them as lessons. She recognized the orientation system immediately, the gradient notation, the passage indicators that described subterranean rather than surface structure, the branching symbol he used for junctions that could accommodate multiple routes simultaneously. She had learned to read this notation before she had learned to read anything else with the same fluency. The subject of the map was a structure she had heard named in whispered conversations in every town along the main road for months preceding the march. Draveth. Not the fortress's surface, its underside. The passages running beneath it through bedrock, cut over generations for drainage and storage, and the private movement of its governing structure. Passages that would not appear on any surface survey. Her father had mapped them with the same total precision she had seen in every piece of his work. Entry points, interior dimensions, junction structure, the distances between the points where the underground network connected to the fortress's occupied levels above. He had assembled it from the correspondence, from sources on both sides who had trusted him with pieces, separately, each believing they were giving him partial intelligence for a narrow purpose. He had seen the whole it could become, and had built it quietly over months, and sealed it here where no one who didn't know would ever find it. She folded the sheets carefully against the wind and placed them inside her coat. She remained at the marker for a moment longer, not looking at anything specific, just present. Then she descended. Gareth saw her coming down the final switchback. He had been facing upward since she disappeared over the shelf's edge, not with any intention to observe the ritual itself, but with the involuntary attention of a man whose focus has been fixed on a point for so long that redirecting it requires active decision. His men had stopped speaking some time ago. Voss stood 2 feet to his left and had been deliberately quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was watching something develop and choosing not to name it aloud yet. The transformation had come without warning, without any identifiable trigger. She had been on the shelf above him, out of his sight, and something had moved through the mountain silence that was felt before it was understood, and his wolf had surfaced in response before he had applied any deliberate thought to the situation. Not a full shift. The partial kind, which carried its own difficulty, the body beginning to reorganize while the will held its position, the resulting tension of 2 states pulling against each other in the same frame. His hands had changed before he caught the movement. The sound from his throat had not been a word. He had pulled it back by force. The reintegration left the residual tightness in the chest and shoulders that always followed when the wolf had come up fast against suppression, not pain, something closer to the particular fatigue of a muscle held under sustained counterstrain. The wolf had settled back but not deeply, sitting present at the surface instead of where it usually lived in the quiet hours. Voss had not said anything. He had gone still and looked at Gareth with an expression that was not alarm. Gareth had shifted in every circumstance that battle provided, and Voss had been beside him for most of them. It was a more careful look than alarm, the look of a man placing information he has collected across 3 days into an arrangement that has just resolved into a legible shape. Neither of them spoke about it. The wolf's response to her grief had operated outside the range of his governance. That was the part he could not file into any existing category. He had managed the wolf in situations that tested experienced alphas significantly. This was not a question of discipline. The mate bond had moved first, and the rest of him had followed before the chain of authority that usually ran the other direction had any opportunity to assert itself. He had not experienced that before. He was not certain it could be trained against, and that uncertainty was something he was going to have to find a way to carry. When Willa reached the trail's base, her face was composed, and her posture was what it had been since the road, direct and settled, the bearing of someone who has done what they came to do and is already in the business of what comes next. She stopped in front of him, which he had not expected. She reached into her coat. "My father was making this," she said, and held out the folded sheets. He unfolded them and angled them toward the gray light. The notation was dense and specific, a personal system, clearly, built over long practice. Then, the orientation marks resolved, and the structure came through. Passages, junctions, interior measurements, access points, the whole of a structure's hidden architecture mapped by someone who had spent years carefully assembling it. He understood what he was holding. He stood in the snow at the base of Stonecrown Peak, with Draveth's underground rendered in a dead man's handwriting, and understood that this was what Hadwin had been trying to prevent reaching anyone who could use it. This was what Edric had been killed for. This was what Finn had been killed for, tangentially, collaterally. A child on a road who happened to be the son of the man who held the thing that Hadwin needed erased. He refolded the sheets without speaking. Then he held them out for her to take back. Their hands met at the transfer point. The wolf came to the surface again, not the partial shift, just the sound, low and involuntary, out of him before he had made any decision about it. He felt Willa go still. Her fingers closed around the folded sheets, and she stepped back 1/2 step, and he knew immediately from the way she moved that it was not fear driving it, not the startled withdrawal of someone threatened. The measured, careful distance of someone who has encountered something they need a moment to understand before they decide what to do with it. She looked at him steadily. He held her gaze and said nothing, because the explanation she deserved was not one he had the right to deliver in the space of this moment, on this cold shelf at the base of a mountain where she had just buried her brother. She looked down at the map in her hands. Something in the contact point still seemed to reverberate through her, not physical, not imagined either, but precise enough that dismissing it would have required active dishonesty. Something moved through her expression. Not simple resolution, not the clean arrival of a thing understood and categorized. The beginning of something that she was holding at a considered distance, processing without yet deciding what it meant for the ground she was standing on. Which was the only response that made sense, given everything she had come from and everything she had yet to face. He did not press her. She looked back up at him, and what was in her eyes when she looked had a different quality from every other time she had looked at him on the trail. Not warmer, not softer, but wider somehow, more space in it. As if the category she had been holding him in had shifted slightly without her fully authorizing the shift, and she was aware of the movement without having yet decided what to do about it. "We should go south," she said. "Yes," he said. She turned and took the rope, and was already moving before his men had fully reformed behind her. Gareth fell into step at her side. Voss came behind them without comment. The peak drew back above as the trail descended, and the map sat inside her coat against her chest, and below them the route south opened through the pale gray morning, in the long, steady silence of a world that was simply continuing. The southern road looked different going back. Willa had noticed this phenomenon before. Routes that carried one quality on approach and a different quality on return, as if the direction of travel changed what the terrain was willing to show. Going north, the road through Ironvale had been a problem to be solved, each junction a decision, each incline a calculation. Going south, it was simply ground already understood, and the understanding sat in her body rather than her head, which left her attention free for other things. The things her attention found were not comfortable. She walked at the same pace she had kept for 4 days, and thought about the map inside her coat, and the name on the seal of the scout's orders, and the way Gareth had gone still when she said Hadwin at the shepherd's shelter. She thought about her father writing that name in a letter he had not intended for her to find, addressing it to a correspondence address she would never be able to trace. She thought about what it meant that Hadwin had known Edric's work well enough to want it destroyed, the level of access that required, the sustained attention to something her father had believed was operating quietly beneath anyone's notice. Edric had been careful. He had been more than careful. And he had still not been careful enough, because Hadwin had more information than he should have had, and had acted on it faster than her father had calculated he would. She pressed her hand briefly against the outside of her coat and felt the folded sheets through the wool. Then she moved her hand away and kept walking. The ambush came at the crossing where the southern road met the river bend. She had not been to this section of the road before. The route north had taken them through the forest's interior and rejoined the main road further down. This was the primary military crossing, wide enough for supply carts, the ford marked by stacked stones on both banks that Edric's old survey notes had described as maintained by the border settlements. She registered the geography as they approached it through the final tree line, reading the sight lines and the terrain distribution with the involuntary assessment she had been performing since childhood. The far bank had too many places to stand behind. She stopped. Gareth drew level with her, and she did not need to explain what she was doing. He had learned, over 4 days, the significance of her pauses. "East bank," she said quietly. "The boulder arrangement on the left is wrong for natural placement, and the scrub line is too dense for late-season growth. Something's been cut and stacked into it." He looked at the crossing for 3 seconds. Then he said quietly to Voss, "How many?" Voss had his eyes on the far bank with the particular flat focus of a man running rapid probability. The stacked scrub runs 40 feet along the bank, at standard spacing for a covered line that length. 8, possibly 10. Willa was already turning. "There's a secondary ford upstream. My father marked it in his notes as unusable in high water, but we're in the dry season's low. It won't be on any military survey. It's too shallow for supply carts and too irregular for troop movement." "How far upstream?" Gareth said. "A quarter hour if we move." He turned to his men with short, clear directions. Quiet, compact formation, horses kept to the softer ground. No pace that would announce itself to whatever was waiting at the main ford. He did not look back at the ambush site, and she did not either. There was nothing productive in looking at a trap after you had recognized it. They moved east along the riverbank through thin scrub growth, keeping below the sight line of the far bank. Willa went ahead of the group with the river's sound as her orientation. Not the rope, not the sled. Finn's journey complete, and behind her now on the mountain. Just herself and the ground and the river's noise and the ford her father had marked with the notation. Passable in low water, uneven crossing, use with care. The ford was exactly what the notes described. The river here was wide and shallow, the bed visible through the slow current as a scatter of submerged stone and sand channel, irregular and requiring judgment at each step. Not designed for anything larger than individuals crossing one at a time with direct knowledge of the bottom's layout. She went first, testing each step before she weighted it, building the path as she moved. Not the cartographic notation, but the living version, the actual negotiation of ground. She reached the far bank with wet boots and cold feet and turned to direct the horses through the line she had found, indicating by hand where the depth allowed the animal's footing and where the current covered a drop. The crossing took time. The horses were steady, but had to be managed carefully, each one guided through separately by Voss and the guards, with the quiet precision of men who were aware that the main ford was close enough that noise carried. Gareth crossed last, keeping watch on the riverbank's upper line. When he reached the far side, he looked at her with something in his expression that was not surprise. He had stopped being surprised by her, but had the quality of a man updating an already revised assessment. They were on the far bank and moving into the eastern tree cover when shouting broke behind them at the main ford. Then the sound of horses moving fast through water. Not the careful, quiet approach of troops maintaining concealment, but the driven urgency of a pursuit that had realized its quarry was no longer where expected. "Move," Gareth said, and the group moved. The trees absorbed them within seconds, and the pursuit did not resolve. The horses behind them were operating on the main road's geography, and the eastern route through this section of Iron Vale had no military designation and no established trail. Willa took them through the undergrowth at a sustained pace, using the river sound to the west and the slope of the terrain to the north to hold orientation without visible landmarks, moving until the sounds behind them had thinned to nothing and the forest had closed in fully enough that the afternoon light reached the ground only in narrow breaks. She slowed when a natural clearing opened around a standing stone, and her internal compass told her the base camp was due south, less than 2 hours' travel. The fight itself was brief. 2 of Koreth's pursuit riders had separated from the main group and come through the eastern tree line on a wider angle than their companions. They were good riders and quick to react when the clearing came into view. But they were also men coming into a confined space where 2 shifters and 3 trained guards had already positioned themselves and were no longer moving. The engagement lasted less than a minute. 1 rider escaped back into the trees, 1 did not. The one who remained answered questions. He did not hold out long, and his answers aligned precisely with what Voss and Gareth had pieced together over the last 2 days. He had been stationed on the main road by a Koreth field officer acting on intelligence received through a private channel. Not through Koreth's military hierarchy directly, but through an intermediary who had supplied the route, the group's size, and the expected crossing point. The intermediary had been described to him as an administrative contact operating from the opposing kingdom's capital. He did not have a name. He had a channel, and the channel had provided accurate information twice before, which was enough for his commander to trust it and act on it. Hadwin moves through intermediaries, Voss said. This is the second separate operation we can connect to the same source. It's enough, Gareth said. He wrote the summons himself, sealed it with his personal mark, and sent one of the guards forward to the base camp at speed with orders to have Hadwin brought to camp under a protocol that did not announce itself as an arrest until Gareth was present. He had worked with Hadwin for 7 years. He understood that Hadwin was intelligent enough to disappear if given an indication of what was coming, and he was not willing to give him that indication. They reached the base camp by late afternoon. The camp was as he had left it, ordered, disciplined, the general's management evident in the positioned pickets and the maintained supply lines. The column was ready. 3 days of waiting, and they had not decayed into the particular restlessness that prolonged camp bred in some formations. Gareth registered this with a soldier's automatic accounting and moved through the camp's entry line without pausing for the acknowledgments that came from every side. Hadwin was already there. He had been brought to the command tent on a pretext about supply routing, a plausible reason consistent with his role. And he sat at the field table with the composed patience of a man who had been inconvenienced rather than threatened. He was in his middle years, silver at his temples, dressed in the council's functional travel weight rather than campaign gear. He looked up when Gareth entered and arranged his expression into the practiced attentiveness of a senior administrator prepared to be useful. Then he saw Willa. Something moved across his face in the half-second before he controlled it. Not fear precisely. More the rapid recalibration of a man who has encountered a variable his planning did not account for, assessing its implications faster than most people could register what they were seeing. He controlled it completely within a breath, but Gareth had been watching for it. Hadwin, Gareth said, and sat down across the table without preamble. Voss placed the sealed note from the inn between them. Willa placed the letter she had found at the village. Edric's correspondence, with Hadwin's name written in her father's hand in the context she had described at the shelter. She set it down with a steadiness that came from having thought this moment through since the mountain. And then she stepped back slightly and let the evidence speak from its own position. Gareth did not raise his voice. He stated what the evidence showed in the same register he used to deliver campaign briefings. Specific, sequential, without embellishment. The soldiers directed through an undesignated corridor carrying his banner. The attack on a village outside his campaign's formal advance zone. The scouts at the inn with Hadwin's seal on their orders. The rider at the ford moving on intelligence that accurately described Gareth's location, group size, and intended crossing point. The name in a dead cartographer's correspondence. Hadwin looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Willa once, briefly, assessing, and she held his gaze without expression, neither pressing nor retreating. The cartographer had intelligence that would have compromised the campaign, Hadwin said finally. His voice was steady, which Gareth had expected. Both sides root intelligence in a single private archive. In the wrong hands. He was making corridors, Willa said. She had not spoken until now. Her voice was level and clear. He was trying to remove the incentive for the campaign entirely. His archive was not a weapon. It was an argument against this war. Arguments of that kind, in the hands of the wrong intermediary. He sent a 12-year-old boy out of the village to keep him safe, she said. Your soldiers found him on the road 2 hours outside the settlement. He was on foot, and he was carrying nothing. He was not a threat to anything except your assumption that my father's work could be erased if the people who knew about it were gone. The tent was very quiet. Hadwin looked at Gareth, and what passed between them was the particular collapse of a long professional relationship arriving at its final accounting. There was no useful question left to ask. The documents existed. The evidence was sequential and sourced. The name was present at every connection point. The only remaining fact to establish was the one Hadwin provided himself. Not from conscience, but from the practical intelligence of a man who understood when the position was indefensible. I had an arrangement with Koreth's administrative faction, he said, pre-existing the campaign's planning. When I learned about the cartographer through his correspondence, I determined that his archive, if it reached you or anyone with the authority to act on it, would end the war in a way that benefited neither side's existing arrangements. He looked at the table. The campaign's outcome was not my objective. The arrangements were. Gareth stood up. You'll travel to the capital under guard, he said. The council will receive a full accounting. You will not speak to anyone about the contents of what was discussed in this tent until you are before the full session. 2 guards came in from the tent's exterior, and Hadwin stood and went with them without further statement. He did not look at Willa again. When the tent was quiet, Voss went to the entrance and stood at the flap with his back to the interior, which was his way of not being present without removing himself. Gareth looked at the documents still laid out on the table. Then he looked at Willa. She was looking at the space where Hadwin had been sitting. Her expression had the finished quality of a thing that has been held in tension for days and has now released. Not relief exactly, not resolution, but the particular quiet that follows when the shape of a thing finally corresponds to what you believed it to be. Her father had not died because of an accident. Her brother had not died for nothing. She had carried the correct conclusion for days without the ability to confirm it, and confirmation had a weight of its own, separate from comfort. The map, Gareth said. She reached inside her coat and placed it on the table between them. He looked at it. If Draveth falls cleanly, the campaign ends without a siege, fewer men, faster resolution. He paused. I will not pretend the route changes nothing, because it changes everything. My father intended it to end the war, she said, not to fuel it. Using it as he mapped it would end it. One entry, one direct action, no prolonged engagement. Koreth's garrison at Draveth falls inside a week, and the rest of their frontier network has no anchor point. The war is over before winter closes the roads. She was quiet for a moment. He would have chosen that outcome. He nodded. She looked at the map on the table and did not pick it up. Her father had built it for a purpose, and the purpose existed independently of the path it had taken to reach this table. Whatever Edric had believed about negotiation and intermediaries, the map itself had always been a tool, and tools did not carry the intentions of their makers into every hand that used them. They carried their function. "I need to know something," she said. He waited. "Your soldiers, the ones Hadwin directed. I understand they were operating outside your orders. I understand the authorization was fraudulent." She looked at him directly. "That doesn't close the account. My father is dead. Finn is dead. An authorization given without your knowledge is still authorization given in your name, and your name is the one that travels with the people who carry it." He held her gaze and did not look away. He did not offer the explanation again. He had given her the facts, and she had already placed them correctly. What she was asking for was not clarification. "No," he said. "It doesn't close the account." She looked at him for a long moment. Something worked through her expression. Not forgiveness, which would have been too simple and too quick for the weight of what she was measuring. More like the recognition of a man who was not going to arrange his answer to suit himself, and the particular difficulty of knowing what to do with that recognition when it arrived from a direction you had not expected it. "Then I need time," she said, "to decide what the account requires. You have it. I mean, time that isn't conditional on anything. Not on the map, not on the bond or whatever the bond means. I felt it at the summit. I'm not pretending I didn't. But I'm not resolving something I haven't had space to examine just because the circumstances have a momentum to them." She said it cleanly, without apology for the directness. "I stayed through this because you did not treat Finn's journey as a favor you were performing. I am staying beyond it because I am choosing to. Those are different things, and I need you to understand the difference." He understood it. He had understood it before she said it, because it was the same distinction he had been operating inside of since the road. The difference between what the wolf decided and what he decided, and the necessity of those two things eventually arriving at the same answer through the same reasoning rather than by default. "I understand the difference," he said. She nodded once. Then she picked up the map and held it for a moment and set it back on the table between them. "My father built this carefully," she said. "Use it the way he would have wanted it used, quickly, and then finished. That's the plan." Outside, the camp was moving through its evening routines. The low percussion of a formation preparing for resumed march. The particular ordered noise of several thousand people who had been waiting and were now readying for the forward motion that the waiting had been for. The sound of it came through the tent walls with the clarity of wind-carried detail. Willa turned toward the tent entrance, then stopped with her back to him. "Gareth," he waited. He would have liked that someone finally found the map. She walked out into the camp, and the evening closed around her, and behind her on the field table, the map of Draveth's hidden passages lay in the amber light of the tent's lantern, waiting for a king who intended to finish a war as cleanly as a dead man had once hoped it could be ended.